Okay, welcome to the Entrusted Podcast. And today we have an inspiring guest, and her name is Lupita Arce, and she's the principal of Sunset Ridge Preschool through 8th grade in the Denver metropolitan area. And she also has a very rich history in education. And Lupita has served as an assistant principal. She's worked in multiple roles in education, including as classroom teacher in a primary age setting, as well as a culturally and linguistically diverse education specialist to help students acquire English as their second language. She holds master's degrees in education and social science, along with a bachelor's degree in sociology, all from the University of Northern Colorado. And she also completed the Educational and Policy Studies program at the University of Denver, earning her principal licensure there. Lupita is passionate about being an effective educator and a motivational leader, and she's also very, very dedicated to maximizing educational opportunities for each and every learner that she has. And so, aside from her professional life, I know one thing that is near and dear to Lupita's heart is the support of her family. Absolutely. That is her network and her safe space, I would say. She has a wonderful husband. His name is Marcos. And she has 2 children. Jared, he is 18 and now in college. And Nikteha, and she is Lupita's daughter and 16. And I know a force in her life that has really been a cheerleader for her, a support for her through all the ups and downs and all of her decisions has been her lovely mother. So I want to give her a shout out to her mom, Candelaria, because she certainly has raised a strong young woman who is just doing all kinds of great things. And so join us as we dive into Lupita's journey and insights on educational leadership. And so welcome, Lupita.
Thank you.
And just to get us started, today's episode is about a leader's why. And I thought we could maybe begin by having the audience just listen or watch, depending on what people are doing, and hear what brought you into this industry, and more importantly, the leadership role you hold today, because I know this is your first year as a principal.
Right. In thinking about my why, the statement that I would give is my why really is to leave a legacy of love and leadership. And so those are 2 things that I hold very dear to me, both personally and professionally. How I got into education is kind of an interesting story. I was first generation to college. My mom grew up as a migrant farm worker, and so she traveled with my grandparents to various communities and didn't really have the opportunity to stay in a stable learning environment because as the crops shifted and changed, they traveled, and then she would start a school year somewhere, end a school year somewhere else. But she was really passionate about education in general. So when she raised us, my 3 brothers and myself, as a single mother, she really instilled the value of education and education as a means to opportunity and options. So she didn't tell us what we had to be when we grew up or what we had to do or what we had to have. But she really led us to really believe that we could do anything, but it would be through education. And when I went to college, there were a lot of key programs and people that positioned me for it. One of them being High School Upward Bound. So High School Upward Bound is a TRIO program that works with students who are first generation to college. And they do a lot of things more than just academic enrichment. So academic enrichment and tutoring are a part of it, but then they also take us on experiential learning activities. They were so critical to my being able to enroll and participate and be successful in college that I figured I wanted to work in the nonprofit sector. I wanted to do for other students what High School Upward Bound had done for me. So I majored in sociology. After graduating, I worked at a middle and high school as an academic advisor. Then there was the season where we start to apply for colleges. And it was really heartbreaking for me when there was a student applying to college with something like a 1.5 GPA. And I felt like that was really hard because that student wanted to pursue education, but really had limited options. And I got to thinking about, what do I do about that? Somebody who believes that education creates opportunity. And I figured it had to be teaching. It had to be going into a classroom, doing the thing that I thought was most critical for success. So literacy and math skills, right? We can't do very much without fundamental knowledge. And that's why I went into primary as opposed to a high school content level course. So I got an alternative teaching licensure and became a teacher.
Yeah. And, I guess one question I would have as a follow-up to that is, do you feel like you went into teaching just based on the story you described as a
absolutely
calling?
not. I think the calling was there, right? So even when I said I wanted to work in nonprofit, I didn't work in nonprofit that serves other groups or other industries. It was very much education-based.
Yeah. Okay. Mamas matter a lot, don't they?
I 100% agree. And so my mom is an amazing woman, but she also gave me the opportunity to be mothered by other people. So she wasn't possessive in her mothering. My grandmother, she watched us every single day. There wasn't a day from the time before I was 12 that I wasn't at my grandmother's house. So she's very important in my life, as well as my godmother. So my godmother, her name is Teresa. She did a lot of things for me that made me who I am. And so when I think of the value of mothers, like my mom, love her above and beyond. And I know that she gave everything she had to give. I also know that she did everything she could with what she had. And she knew that. So she allowed other people to come in and also raise me like really in a community environment.
Well, and I think parents are always a child's first teacher, right? And I think bus drivers are right up there too, because sometimes they set the tone for kids who are on their way to school before they ever get to the door of the teacher. So that's important. Well, let me ask you just a fun little personal question, because your given name is actually Maria Guadalupe, right? Mm-hmm. How did Lupita happen?
So it's not uncommon for people to have nicknames. And in my family alone, I have an Aunt Mary, I have a cousin who's Big Mary, and then I have another cousin, Maria Alicia. So we all have Mary or Marias. But Guadalupe is commonly abbreviated to Lupita.
Okay.
So in my family, I just went by Lupita, to the point where in middle school, the first day of middle school, all of the students were gathered in the cafeteria. And teachers came out, called their list, and you were supposed to go with that teacher. So a teacher says, Maria Arce. And I was like, somebody has the same last name as me. And then I realized it was me. So that's how closely I identify with Lupita.
That's fun. That's good. Okay. Well, and you kind of talked about this a little bit, but I just want to follow up with something about the support and the learning and maybe the mentors you've had along the way to help you. Because our goal here on the podcast is to help aspiring leaders, people who might want to go to a different position, or maybe they're already in a leadership role, but are thinking about the next steps, like where they want to be the next 3 to 5 years. So talk about more of the support and the mentors also professionally that you've had.
When I think about mentorship, I think about it in a lot of different ways. But I do think that fundamentally, we all have mentors, whether or not we identify them as such, in that moment. So when I decided I wanted to be a teacher, I thought about all of the other teachers in my life who I could call upon. And so some of them were people who I had studied in undergrad with, and they were actively teaching. And so I said, hey, can I stop by your classroom? And I had a couple of people who would let me stop by and then gave me some of their time just to talk me through what it looked like to actually be a teacher. And then I thought back to my own preschool teacher. So it was called early childhood education. And her name is Mrs. Lubin. She was, I think, a mentor to my mom, to the degree where as we were growing, my mom kept talking about Mrs. Lubin and they never lost that connection. And then when I had my confirmation, she was teaching at the elementary school a block from my grandmother's house. So she became my godmother. When I was in early childhood, right, 4 years old, I didn't think of her as my mentor. I thought of her as a teacher. But as I grew, I came to see that those are the people who have a lasting impact. As a professional, I think my greatest mentor is Maureen Willie. I'm going to drop that name. She and I shared a classroom for 8 years and never tired of each other. But in that time, I think that she showed me how to make an impact regardless of the outside environment. So what we control is our classroom, but she's the human I want to be like. So she raised her kids in a way that I was trying to do, right? Because I decided to raise my kids in a way that was different from how I was raised. And so I needed mentorship in that regard. And the heart that she has. So she organized turkey giveaways and different things for families where she saw a need. So as opposed to seeing a need and then feeling unable to meet it, she saw a way to do that. Mm-hmm. And so Maureen really inspired me in that way. One of the other things is that when I started working with Maureen, she's like, you're going to be here for a while, Lupita, but you're meant for leadership. And so for her to see that in me and to affirm it was motivating. And as our time together kind of started coming to a close, she's the one that was like, I'm getting ready for retirement. And your kids are getting older. And this is really a time to start thinking about what your next steps are. So I looked around at principals who I had in the past and reached out to them for some conversations. And again, so what I had done when I decided I wanted to teach is again what I had done when I decided I wanted to be a principal. And so people gave me of their time to really walk me through what it looks like, what it takes, what the pathway they took, and how it benefited them, and maybe even some of the things that they had to give up or sacrifice as part of that. And it gave me the opportunity to decide if I was ready for those sacrifices, because I did know that one of them would be time with my family, which I really valued to the point where I prioritized it. And now I knew I was going to have less time with my family, but a greater impact at work. And also my kids were in a different position. So Maureen helping me to really just walk through that is one of the things that kept me going. And when we started working together, it wasn't a mentorship like set up in the first place. It was as colleagues.
So it happened naturally.
It happened very naturally.
Yeah.
And then there were the other people who I just remembered they did this really well and in a way that I want to emulate. So let me see what their path was like, and let me see what I can emulate, and then let me see what I need to put my own twist on.
Right. And, one of the things I've said a lot in my career, and I still believe it, I think we learn from everyone. And sometimes leaders learn what to do. And sometimes we also learn what not to do.
Right.
Have you found yourself thinking about that from time to time, about as you've gotten deeper into leadership roles?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that really benefits me too, right, is the mentorship that I find in text. So when I read and I think about the kind of leader that I want to be, I will read and say, oh, when I worked for the leader who said they were going to do something and then didn't, and I didn't feel right about that. Mm-hmm. Now I have the words to identify that as a fracture of trust. Mm-hmm. So that's absolutely something that I really value and hold true to, right? If I say I'm going to do something, then I need to do it, or I need to follow up and explain the circumstances for why I'm not ready to do that. So really good training that I had was Leader in Me training. And Leader in Me is based on Stephen Covey's work with the 7 habits. And that helped me because you show up as who you are.
Right,
And that's something that I've heard you say, and I absolutely believe, right? So
wherever I go, I show up, right?
I needed to be who I wanted to work with.
I know your family, you talked about prioritizing your time with your family. When did you know you really had to do that in your career?
Marcos and I, like, our whole story was just a whirlwind. Within a year of meeting each other, we were married and pregnant. It happened first, marriage and then pregnancy. But then that second year, I was still teaching. So Marcos and I met my first year teaching. My second year of teaching, I was pregnant with Jared. And then when I became a mother and realized all of the sacrifices that my mom made, I just knew that that's how I wanted to mother. And what it took more than anything else was time. So Marcos and I had to get really clear on the people we were raising in our house. And the way that I think of it is my children are our greatest contribution to the world. So when I think of my children as my greatest contribution to the world, there's nothing that comes before that. So that's how I got really clear on that priority.
Yeah, as a mom, I can remember times where maybe I had a little mom guilt because, if my child had a runny nose or something else and we were all trying to meet all of our obligations, there were days sometimes I'd go to work and I'd think, wow, I need to take care of my own kiddo. And here I am taking care of everybody else's kiddos. Have you ever felt that way, or has that tugged at your heart?
There were certainly times where I felt like that. And the benefit was that I had such a strong support system. So my mom would pitch in. Marcos was there equally as a partner.
And he has his own powerful story.
Yeah. Marcos is an amazing human. But in raising our kids, again, that was a lesson I learned from my mom, right? It wasn't just the two of us. It was my mom, it was my grandmother, it was Marcos's mom, it was Marcos's dad. It was all of us rallying.
A whole network, in other words. One of the things that I like to tell new leaders or aspiring leaders is, even when you're a leader, even when you're a principal, even when you're a superintendent, life happens. Do you have any experiences like that you'd like to share? Like when life happens and you've got all these other obligations, talk about when you've had to manage that.
I'm gonna share a story with you, and it'll come back around, right?
Yeah.
Because it is about Jared is born, and I'm thinking this is my greatest contribution to the world, right? And a few years later, 2 years later, Nikta has born, and I take a new job in a different district. And with that comes this period of adjustment. So I just know I'm going to have to be working more hours than usual, put my mom on notice, like, hey, mom, we're going to need some additional help. Marcos knows that he's going to have to step up in ways that we can't even predict yet because the situation is going to be different. And I feel like I was under a lot of stress, and that balance shifted, right? So I was giving a lot to work and less to home. And then that year ended, and the following year, mid-year, I found out that I had a brain tumor. And so my daughter was about 1.5 years, and my son was about 3. And then I had brain surgery. So I'm coming out.
What a scary time.
It was, terrifying, right?
Because you were young.
I was 28 at the time.
Wow.
And so they're wheeling me out of the elevator. And I remember seeing all of the people who I mentioned, right? My mom is there, my grandmother's there, my aunts and uncles are there, my brothers are there, Marcos is there. They set Nikteha on the bed, and I'm just like, hi guys. And then they wheel me away. So, that's who was there in this really critical period. after I feel like I had just undergone a bunch of stress where they weren't like the core focus of that. So I think that some balance is going to be different in different times. But losing sight of that is also its own obstacle. And I think that I had to regain sight to say, oh man, that balance was very skewed. And this is how I need to rein it in. And when times get busy, I can sit down and say, okay, where's my family fitting in? Have I made clear what I need? Have they made clear what they need? And if not, let's start there and then piece it together. So stepping into the principalship, and even as an assistant principal, some of the things that were helpful to me were to sit in a room and say, hey, my name is Lupita Arce, and I breathe for Jared and Nikteha. And so what that means is that when Jared and Nikteha need something, I'm going to do that. This year, Jared went away to college for the first time, and I'm just starting principalship. The second week of school, he's moving into his dorm. So I had a really tough decision to make, right? Do I come to work, or do I move my child into his dorm for the very first time? And then I was like, no, that decision's already made. And I think that other people watching me to see if there's alignment between what I say is important to me and what I choose to do, I need to make sure that they see it because I need it for myself.
Well, I think one of the things that's very important in terms of symbolic leadership is exactly that. And it's also where you choose to go and where you choose not to go are equally important. And people notice both. You know, we can all say a lot of words, but it's action, right?
Right. And I think that it's us keeping that in mind for ourselves. So it is easy to say, I think that they're the most important thing in my life, and then let things slip gradually. So it's not necessarily that other people will notice, but sometimes we don't even notice ourselves. And so it's taking that pause and having people who I trust enough to say, hey, Lupita, where you been?
Yeah. Yeah. We all need that. Those reminders.
Yep.
Right. So good. Well, those are excellent stories for sure. Well, let me ask you this. What has surprised you about your first year as principal? What surprises have you had?
The surprise really is how much of it does depend on who I show up as, right? So it's not necessarily what processes are in place or what structures are in place, but really first people want to see who I am. Am I who I say that I am? And then we can start with trust. And trust is what allows us to have systems in place. But definitely, I think my biggest surprise was just the trust building and knowing that I can't go beyond that without establishing it first.
Right. Okay. Well, you mentioned a little bit about this, but wherever I go, I show up. Wherever we go, we show up. So it sounds like you're talking a little bit about that in terms of the symbolism. But do you want to add anything to that? Wherever I go, I show up. Have you had examples of that?
I think
maybe where you caught yourself.
Where I caught myself. So as I think of what principles I want to base my leadership on, integrity has always been one of them, right? And integrity is that alignment. How do I stay whole and true to myself when there are a lot of demands being made on my time and my mental energy? And so sometimes when I show up and I feel uncomfortable in a space, I'm trying to think. So my first district-wide leadership team meeting, I was like, I don't know if I'm in the right room here because I just got here. So that was really hard for me. And then as people are welcoming me, right? How do I show up in that space? And there's a tendency to want to be who you think other people want you to be. And so that's where I had to catch myself, instead of trying to mind read and say, who do I need to be in this space? Just realizing that I'm already who I need to be in this space.
That's right.
And that really means I ask other professionals to call me Lupita as opposed to Maria. It does mean that I may have to share other stories, right? Like my family life looks different from a lot of other people's. I live in a multi-generational household. So one of the greatest honors of my life is that my mom, I get to care for her, right? And I appreciate that, but it's not the same everywhere. And that's okay.
We all have our own stories. That's for sure. You mentioned showing up at a district leadership team meeting. I heard recently you did a pretty cool leadership activity. Maybe just describe a little bit of that and then talk about how that felt, because you're in your first year as principal. And of course, this group is maybe 80, 85 people from all different types of leadership across a big school district. And some are more veteran than others. How did that make you feel? And tell us a little bit about what that was.
A little bit of background. So the facilitator is chosen randomly at the meeting prior to lead out an activity at the next month's meeting. When they chose my name, I remember just looking up and being like, fair, right? I've been on the district leadership team for 2 years. Okay, my turn. And then they called on a colleague, the director of marketing, Kelly. And my first thought was like, okay, I know Kelly, we work well together, we'll do fine. And then she came up with the idea of leading the activity in Spanish. And in Spanish, because we do have a lot of newcomer students who are working on their English. And sometimes that's really hard to try to adjust to an entirely different place in terms of lifestyle, and then language also. So with that in mind, always staying student-centered, how do we give an experience similar to that to a room full of administrators? And so the idea is that you lead out a lesson relevant to the audience, but in a language that many of them don't understand. So Kelly and I both speak Spanish and decided to lead it out in Spanish, which gave me all kinds of feelings because my Spanish, so I learned Spanish from my grandmother, right? Which is very like home Spanish, not academic. And Kelly learned Spanish living in another country already as an adult. So very different experiences, very different levels of linguistic comfort. And then I knew in that room, there were going to be administrators who grew up speaking Spanish as their first language. So that made me insecure about my Spanish. But then I also knew, right, that I was going to be with people who didn't speak any Spanish at all.
So did you feel like you were taking a real risk doing this?
Absolutely. To the point where I was like, Kelly, are you sure you want to do this? I don't know. So she was encouraging. And again, we stayed student-centered, thinking about how this would benefit seeing the world maybe with a little bit broader perspective. So we let out an activity. The activity was based on identifying characteristics of students at different ages, right? So like, what might a child who is 6 need from the adults in that space? And what might a child who is 9 need from the adults in that space? What might someone who is 12 need from adults in that space? Because that's what we do, is we serve children.
Did you take them out of their comfort zone?
But they had to do it with text in Spanish.
Oh,
and what it meant for people in the room was something different for a lot of people. So we got a lot of feedback. And those native Spanish speakers who I told you about earlier talked about what it was like from their perspective, where they understood the content just fine. So they were in their comfort zone, but maybe not in the roles that they had been accustomed to. And then other people who are used to leading the group, all of a sudden feeling like they weren't quite sure what was happening, or they understood what was happening, but didn't really know how to contribute to the goal of the group. And I think that everyone was kind of pushed in a different way. So it accomplished exactly what we needed to accomplish in that meeting.
Do you still have friends in that group now?
I have more friends in that group now, which is pretty cool because part of what it tells is when we show up as our whole selves, then people really like us, because I think that sometimes when we are trying to be who we think other people want us to be, there's no authenticity in that. And so it's harder to connect because they don't know who they're connecting to, and you're only connecting to who you think that person wants you to be.
Talk to me about what you think your greatest challenge has been in terms of your leadership roles that you've had.
Mm-hmm. I do think that coming into leadership was especially challenging for me because I didn't see a lot of people in those spaces who look like me. And that was pretty rough because it created the notion that, well, maybe those spaces aren't for me. And
made you question yourself.
Right. And getting over that hurdle for myself would have been the biggest challenge. In terms of working with other people, figuring out the systems, figuring out the processes, those are great challenges that I feel like I've been trained for. But no one trains you for finding your space, with finding your place within other spaces.
Yeah, and really defining who you are in those spaces. Mm-hmm. Is that fair?
I would agree, right? Because I think, though, that process of defining who I am, what my priorities are, what I'm willing to sacrifice and when, prepared me for that. And I think that sometimes if we don't do that work in advance, then we're doing that work in the midst of it.
Yeah, yeah. Have you had any embarrassing moments as a leader?
Oh my gosh, I'm sure I have.
Can you think of a time in this first year as principal where...
I'm kind of curious. I'm like, ooh, do you know something I don't know? Well, just a couple of weeks ago, I was standing in front of the staff who now I've been with for about 11 weeks, and still referenced, well, here at Fairview, we...
You call them by the other school, right?
Yes.
Oops.
And so I felt like my face get red. Yeah. And it was the assistant principal who called me out, and I was like, well done, friend. Well done. Aside from that.
Oh, how about a funny time in education?
A funny time in education. I've tried to make every day funny. So even as a teacher, when a kid did something that I was like, oh man, I'm going to have to give you a consequence for that. At first I tried to see the humor in it. And then I tried to remember, like, it's actually funny. I still need to have like control over this space. So we'll have a consequence. We won't repeat it. But in terms of a specific funny incident, I don't know. I still think about this one sometimes. I taught first grade, and I was teaching first grade at the time, and we were talking about sizes, and it was an ELD lesson. But small, medium, large, and then also like little, medium, big. And a kid's like, and then after big comes bigote. So he was conjugating the word big, using a Spanish language ending, which I thought was fun. And then he's like, get it, bigote, because it's also like mustache.
Okay, like a dual meaning.
But I always love language play. Like, to me, that is really fun and engaging.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of other ways. One thing that we did this year to build morale and have some fun is our staff went to the Museum of Illusions, where everyone had the opportunity to play games and find themselves in situations that we don't on an everyday basis. And
you learn from each other that way about
Absolutely.
Who people are? Yeah. It's kind of fun to do things out of context sometimes, I think, like that, because you do learn more about people as human beings as opposed to just people who are accomplishing professional tasks every day. What leadership advice, let me ask you this one, what leadership advice do you think you would give to yourself if you could reflect back before your current leadership role?
As I think about leadership and advice related, I guess I would phrase it like this, like prepare for the challenge, the hard, and be okay with that. So I think relationships are fun when it's easy, but real when you go through a challenge together and you come out the other end and there's authentic respect there, understanding and just that mutual respect. But I don't think you can get there on easy. I think you have to go through an actual challenge in order to build that.
So it's easy to be a good doctor in a well town.
Exactly.
Huh?
Exactly.
Right? Okay. So Lupita, what is the most important thing you hope to accomplish as a leader of adults and as a role model to young people?
In thinking about how I work with adults now, that's different. Ted Lasso, actually, I really enjoy the show because it's less about soccer and more about coaching, which I've come to find is a big part of this role. Leadership really is walking alongside someone without taking their opportunity to learn and grow. So one of the things that he says is it's not about winning and losing. Success is about helping them, like the young men he serves, be the best version of themselves on and off the field. And so as I work with adult leaders, I really think that mentorship has built up to me becoming the person who I want to be. And I'm still growing in that direction. But how cool that I get to be a part of that for someone else. And that's all I can ask for in terms of working with adults, is helping them become a better version of themselves, for their families, and for the community we serve.
And the children?
The children, that's just where my heart belongs, because I feel about them the same way that I feel about my own kids. They are someone's greatest contribution to the world. And what an honor that we get to serve them. So when I have kids who come into my office just to say hello, I'm responsive to that. When I am giving someone, walking through a mistake with them, right? They made a mistake. It wasn't their best self at that moment. Parents feel really a variety of ways about that, right? Because I'm going to have to give a consequence. They think that now I have this impression of their child that they aren't necessarily proud of, and that the kid isn't necessarily proud of. So I have to walk in this really delicate space with this family. And I think the greatest gift I can give that kid is that at the end of it, that kid has restored relationships. They have had a consequence, and I define a consequence as what needs to happen for your brain and your body to make a better choice next time. And then after you've restored your relationships and had your consequence, then we move on. And I'm going to love you then the same way I love you right now and the same way I loved you yesterday.
We are their parents when their parents aren't around, that is for sure. Well, Lupita, is there anything that I haven't asked you about your why that you want to share as we wrap up?
I think it's important to know. So my global why is a legacy of love and learning. And when I think about anything that I do, I compare it to that standard. So did I show love in that experience? And did I create an opportunity for learning? And if I did, then I feel like I'm living in alignment. So I'm upholding integrity. When I didn't, then I make a plan to do better, because I don't expect perfection of anyone else or from myself. But when I think about my why, it really is continuous improvement.
Well, that's great. And I know that just because you're the principal at Sunset Ridge today, in the here and now, that we're going to hear a lot about Lupita in the years to come, because you're certainly a rock star. And I just want to thank you for being a part of the Entrusted, so that we can help lift other people up and help them think about their why too. So thank you, Lupita.
I appreciate the opportunity, Dr. Swanson, to be a part of this.